feeling the future. Is this evidence of ESP, extrasensory perception, having the future influence you in the present? Or is it not? Or is this just bad science? And to start this off, before Eddie and I get into it, I want to show you a bit of video when Daryl Bem, who's the author of Feeling the Future, appeared on the Colbert Report. You might get an impression from that Daryl Bem is maybe not one of the premier social psychologists, but in fact he is. And when I was in graduate school, I was very much in admiration of Daryl Bem for his theories about impression management and interpreting cognitive dissonance purely in cognitive terms without emotion as impression management tactic, which I was very impressed with that. And he's a brilliant researcher, but he may be a little off on this one. So what Bem was trying to do was take common social psychology research designs, phenomena that had been fairly well accepted in social psychology, and time reverse them. For example, in this case, what you were being presented with was chosen after you made the response. And in some of the other experiments, for example, retroactive priming. Now, priming is where you're shown an image of a positive or a negative picture, something that it would be a really ugly picture or a picture you would want to see. And you have to indicate if it's like it or don't like it, right? With priming, what they do is before you make that choice, they flash on the screen sort of like subliminally, very fast, either good, bad. And that, it has been shown, influences how quickly the person makes their response. So if it's paired together, like if it's a good picture and the word good flashes, then they will respond positively more quickly than if there's an incongruence. Like if it said bad and it was a good picture, they would take a little bit longer to express their positive attitude toward that picture. So that's what priming is about. And so in this case, when Bem did this as retroactive priming, he would show the picture, the person would respond, and then after they responded, they would be flashed good or bad, congruent or incongruent with the picture. Okay. So in each of these, he did that sort of time-reversed mechanism to it, which then, the argument is, of course, that somehow the future is influencing people because this changes their hit rate. They're right or wrong on these choices like we just went through. You know, you picked left or right, or they would indicate a preference for one picture or another, and these. And I think in each of these studies, it was one of those either or, so it was always 50%, and some slight deviation from the 50% is evidence, according to Bem, that there's an influence of the future. And in the facilitation of recall, if I remember correctly, they had them study these words after they had right. So they're given a list of words. They recall all that they can recall of those words. And then later, some of those are chosen at random, and they study those. The ones that they had randomly been chosen to study turned up as a higher percentage of ones recalled. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. So, an interesting thing that he did, and you all responded to it, is there's evidence in the parapsychology literature that suggests that extroversion, or more specifically sensation-seeking, is correlated with this ability to respond greater than chance on these tasks. And so he decided to use two items, I think from a sensation-seeking scale, and he just had people respond to two items, which is kind of unusual. Typically, you would use an entire instrument that has been thoroughly studied, and has been established that it has reliability and validity, but instead he just picked 2 items. And on the basis of those 2 items, he did an analysis of whether or not this personality variable was a factor, which is kind of odd. And those are, I'm easily bored, and I often enjoy seeing movies that I've seen before. Okay, so interesting thing is the analysis that he performed was just t-tests, which is, in essentially, if you've had statistics, it's the most basic test of significance you can do. It just compares 2 groups. In this case, yeah, so it's just very simple analysis. So you can see, though, that the p-values turn out to be pretty good. Most of the studies had roughly 100 participants. And the effect sizes are also in the range that you typically see in social psych research. So that's an interesting phenomenon there. We have something that can't be explained, something that's counterintuitive. Bem doesn't have any explanation, as he said himself, you know, when he said, oh, well, end of interview. And yet we're getting results that are very typical of what's seen in social psych research. So, Eddie, do you have anything you want to say at this point?
How many of you have read the study?
Read the...
Or
yeah.
the preprint of the study. It's very frustrating to read through it because it's very convoluted, and the procedures change halfway through. A lot of the arguments, like the selection of the personality variables, are they seem intuitive. Like, well, yeah, that's a, and so that was motivating a lot of the design. There was shifting of designs kind of stuff halfway through the studies. There were reordering of the studies, and it was interesting because the selection of the statistical techniques. The t-test is a pretty powerful test, actually. But he chose to do one-tailed t-test, one-directional t-tests. And in statistics, you can make those kind of predictions, that selection. A one-tailed t-test, it's easier to find significance than a two-tailed t-test. And you can legitimately do that if you have some a priori prediction ahead of time. Say, well, I expect it to go this direction or that direction. You have good reason for it. And he makes, I think, not unreasonable arguments for the directions that he's predicting. Since the effect, whatever it is, could have gone either way, really, either significantly above or below chance, it may make more sense to do two-tailed t-tests. But even if you don't do two-tailed t-tests, I was really frustrated because of the lack of detail in what was being reported, so that I could actually go in and take a look at what were you doing. You know, whenever you say that you selected most of your material from a set of images that have received a lot of research, but not all of it, you don't know exactly, well, how many and why did you change those? When you have subjects selecting their own images to look at, but I understand. I mean, prima facie, I said, okay, yeah, you want to let people potentially look at things that might be relevant to them to increase the likelihood of physiological reaction. But I don't know. If I were homosexual and I was watching a heterosexual image, I probably would still have a strong physiological reaction. It may be a negative one, but it'd still be a physiological reaction. Other people have noted a correlation between the effect size and subject size, and number of subjects. Generally, as the number of subjects get larger in a study, you're more the results are more reliable. You're more likely to believe that there's something going on. It's not a type 1 error where you find an effect but there really isn't one. And generally, you find a positive correlation between effect size and your N. But in Bem studies, it was exactly the opposite. You found a strong negative correlation. So there was the bigger the effect size. the effect size basically is the difference between the experimental group and the target group. And so it's just basically how big is that effect. And the 0.2, 0.25 is considered a small effect in social science. 0.3, 0.35, a medium effect. 0.4, 0.45, a big effect. And so that's sort of the range. So you would expect that there's something really going on here, a very strong positive correlation between the effect size as it gets bigger and your N. It was exactly the opposite in his studies, suggesting that, well, it's a red flag at the very least. And you wonder, well, you're getting a bigger effect size as your N gets smaller.
Which suggests that when it had a smaller sample size, it might just be a spurious.
And that suggests a spurious, kind of a thing. The other thing that sort of bothered me about it, and I mentioned this to Harold, is it's a sort of a God of the gaps argument. That because I can't find an explanation that makes sense in sort of a normal way, then it's got to be this other kind of a thing. I like the way Harold emailed me back, and I hadn't thought about it. It's the psi of the gaps. And so if you can't really have an explanation that's obvious to you, then it's got to be this.
It's got to be parapsychology.
This other kind of a thing. And so the personality measure that he used, was strange to use that because it was 2-item.
It's not reliable. And it doesn't give you a very good range.
Well, you don't even know if it's reliable. I mean, there's no data on it. We don't know if it's reliable. It could be, or valid.
But it's unlikely. I mean, that's why you have
highly unlikely, yes.
And when you only have 2 items, you have a rather lumpy distribution. If you were to chart that distribution, it would have distinct lumps because there are only 9 possible values when you have 2 5-item. When you take the mean of 2 5-item questions, there are 9 distinct numbers. So it has this very unusual distribution. And there's no reason why he couldn't have used a more complete instrument that has better distribution and better reliability and better validity.
You know, I mean, the other thing is that supposedly these subjects were able to detect the future in some way. But an equally valid argument can be made that the computer that was doing the random number generator actually had ESP and was predicting what people were thinking. And why not?
Or some wizard under the table.
Or Bem.
Or Bem himself.
Bem himself
was magically controlling it from another.
Now, he talks about in his articles that, or where he commented, I can't remember if it was in an article or not, that he didn't run the subjects himself. He had students doing this. But he would greet people coming in, and he would talk to them as they're going out. So he was around. So maybe this is all Bem. Whatever, he has some kind of a special mechanism. I mean, there's a million possible explanations. Probably the most likely ones are methodological errors and inappropriate statistical use. Well, one of the things that Harold has up here is that he was reporting multiple t-tests. And in statistics, and in Bem, he attempted to address this. But whenever you're doing multiple t-tests, you increase the likelihood of finding a significant effect simply because you're doing a lot of them. And what's common in statistics is when you do this, is you have to adjust the p level. You have to adjust the probability level. And he didn't adjust the probability levels. And when you adjust them, if not all, almost all of the significant effects go away. The other thing that bothered me about it, and this is just me, and it's a conceptual issue, but I see it in the literature all the time, continues to talk about highly significant effects. But probability is a reliability measure. It's not a measure of highly significant. And so you read this all the time. It's with p less than 0.01, it's highly significant. Well, no, it's not. It's like being pregnant. Either you're pregnant or you're not. Okay, and so 0.05 or 0.01 and so it's a measure of reliability. It's how reliable are your results? It's highly significant. And you see this especially in sort of greenhorn researchers when they get, I got a p of 0.001. It's highly significant. Well, Yes, I mean, it's highly reliable, really, is what it is, but it keeps saying that, and I thought, surely Bem knows the difference.
I would hope he does.
Surely he would. But that sort of struck me, but
before we get off the
Yeah.
multiple t-test thing, he responded to that and said, well, no, there's one that is really testing the hypothesis. The others are just to eliminate alternative explanations, and they all went in the direction you would expect. That might be true, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and it bothered me at first that he used t-tests. In each of these studies, he sets up these studies with these simple analysis with a t-test, and as Eddie said, t-test is powerful, and what that means, to say it's powerful, means it's more likely to give you a significant result if there is an effect there. Mm-hmm. That's what we mean by power. Looking at the design in the one that we replicated, I wouldn't have done a t-test. I would have done an analysis of covariance.
Yes.
With gender, type of image, erotic or not erotic, and had the covariate be the personality variable. But if he had done that analysis, it would not have been significant. That's why he did t-tests.
If you covariate out that effect.
Exactly. In fact, an interesting thing, if you read the article, he does do multiple t-tests again after the fact, but what he revealed is that if you dichotomize on the personality variable, those that are high on the personality variable have a significant effect, and those that are low, there's no effect. So what we're saying is the only place where he found this ESP effect was with those that were high on that personality variable.
What do you mean high on the personality variable?
High in sensation seeking.
Okay, so extroverts.
Extroversion.
Extroverts. So
Okay, with this too little puny, what did that mean? I mean, what was the answer if you were an extrovert?
Well, extroverts were more likely to have correctly guessed on the erotic images.
Right,
that's the only condition where
how
they
did he decide who an extrovert was with two puny questions?
Well, that's what we've been saying. Yeah, it's not a very good measure of extroversion.
Yeah, what was the answer?
So extroverts would or sensation seekers would not enjoy watching movies over
More than once.
Okay, that's what
Okay, and so depending.
Easily bored.
Yes, and so if they answered both of those, they were high.
The reason I'm asking that is because, in the corporate culture, we do all these personality tests all the time, and all the time I always came out a certain way. Well, those two questions I answered honestly, and they're totally opposite to what my personality is.
Maybe. Is that a Myers-Briggs you took all those times?
Yeah. Yeah.
The two personality questions far more struck me like a test for ADD.
Yeah.
Because I was like, yep, I'm ADD. I get bored and I don't like watching the same movie.
But also look how easily there can be influenced. There's only two items, and if you had just recently happened to have watched a movie again, I mean, I might have answered, when I first thought about that, I said, I don't like to watch movies more than once. But then I thought about, okay, I've seen Star Wars at least a half dozen times.
Yeah.
2001, 5, 6 times, I don't know. And then there's Wizard of Oz. How many times have we seen that,
Little
right?
Mermaid, like 120.
There you go.
Yeah, and if you're gonna make claims about an individual difference like extroversion or sensation seeking, somehow mediating the effect,
You want
to make sure
yeah.
that the psychometric properties of the thing are good. I mean, there's been a lot of research to show that it's reliable, it's consistent over time, it's valid, it actually measures what you think it's going to measure, and so far as I can tell from the reading, he selected these two items because of their prima facie validity. Because you read it and it kind of seems, it seems like it would be right, and that's a problem.
Well, another thing that occurs to me is, and this gets to whether or not the man's honest, but what he might have done is given them the full instrument and then picked these two out because they worked, which would be, but then we have to. Somebody might squeal on him, but that's the possibility. We don't know.
Would it have been better if they only studied people that claimed they could do it?
Well, you can sort of stack the deck in that way. That's sort of you could try to do that. And people have done that.
Yeah.
But this is sort of supposedly a ubiquitous capacity that we all have.
This is selfish for the people that just came. Could we have one sentence recap?
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, well, maybe 4 sentences.
2 sentences?
2 sentences, okay. There's a famous psychologist named Daryl Bem who did some studies where he claims that they showed ESP.
Okay.
And had people respond before the computer chose what they were going to get. So it's as if they were being influenced by the future.
Okay, and did we do this ourselves here?
Yeah.
Okay.
We did that,
Okay.
sort of,
A little bit.
a version of it.
Okay.
Okay, so there are lots of criticisms of this study, and but when I first saw it, I've had issues with the methodologies of my field for many decades now. And when I was in graduate school, we used to call JPSP the Journal of Type 1 Error. And I still think there's an awful lot of Type 1 error. To explain what that is, Type 1 error is when you say that something is real, but it isn't, to put it in layman's terms, common. And there's something called Type 2 error, which is when you say there's not something going on there when there really is. And so these 2 types of error are what researchers are really focused on. You want to minimize both types of error. And sometimes they err more in one way than another. And it's sort of a criticism maybe of the social sciences in general and social psychology in particular is that maybe there's too much Type 1 error. Too often people are claiming to have found effects, as Daryl Bem has here, where there really isn't anything going on. And part of what contributes to this is something called the file drawer problem, what we also used to call the circular file problem. And that is that the only thing that gets into the journals are things that work. So, for example, I had a professor, again, back at Berkeley, who, in my opinion, did the same study over and over and over. And when she got a .05, she published. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Even when people aren't trying to do that, they end up doing that. Because what you'll do is you'll think you'll have a brilliant idea. Oh, what's really going on here is people are influenced by the color of someone's hair. So you do a little study, and a big problem back in that time was they had really small samples, which is a problem because you have a lot more variability going on there. A couple of extreme outliers can drastically influence your result with a small sample. So they would do these little studies, and they would find an effect. They would publish that, and if they don't find an effect, they just move on. So what you have is not a representative. What's being published is not representative of what people are doing in their research. They're failing maybe many times. Like a typical professor at someplace like a major university will have a half dozen studies going on at once. Maybe one of those gives them good results, and it gets published. And that is a problem of Type 1 error because there's an amount of chance involved there. I mean, if he's going to be doing 6 studies, chances are one of them is going to end up being statistically significant by chance. So the other problem is there's a lack of replication. This is true of most sciences, very true in psychology. If you publish something, unless it's really controversial like what Bem has done here, people don't replicate. Because if I were to go out and replicate one of Eddie's studies and submit it to the same journal or even a different journal than he did, they would say, no, that's already been done. Yeah. And I go, but we need to replicate. And they go, we don't care because we've got such demand on our important journal that we will only publish new things that nobody else has done before. Which gets to this other thing that I mentioned up here, counterintuitive finding bias. There's a real pressure in social psychology to come up with something that is unusual. I don't know if this is true in most sciences, but it's a real pressure in social psychology. They expect you to come up with something that people haven't thought of or something that's counterintuitive, such as what Bem is doing right here. And that is, it's a real bias on the discipline. In fact, there's a quote of Daryl Bem that I remembered from way back in the day. He said, what we really need to do in social psychology is look at Bubba psychology. And Bubba was his term for grandmother. So the idea behind that is, you get to know your relatives, your grandmother, find out sort of what their sayings, their truisms about human beings, and then convert that into a formal hypothesis. That was one of his approaches to doing psychology. Bem, that's a quote from Bem. And favoritism in publication, again, they will only publish things that get positive results. So it might be a critically important study like this one on ESP, but if he had gotten all negative results, he wouldn't be getting this published.